The polished leather gleamed under the cruel fluorescent light of the cafe, a deep, expensive crimson that seemed to mock me. It sat there, on the table between her manicured hand and the untouched designer pastry, a silent, screaming testament to everything she'd taken. I saw it, and the familiar ache in my chest tightened. Not just the dull throb of betrayal I'd learned to live with, but a sharp, hot spike of pure, undiluted fury. That bag, that thing, purchased with money that wasn't just mine, not just savings, but the decades of quiet sacrifice, the prudent foregoing of small pleasures, the very foundation of security I had built, stone by careful stone for my old age. My pension, gone, and there it was, swinging casually from her wrist, a gaudy, undeniable flag planted on the ruins of my future. I watched her laugh, her head tilted back, a cascade of perfectly highlighted hair catching the light, her teeth bright and even, a picture of effortless, uncaring success. And I knew in that instant that the quiet suffering, the polite smiles hiding the gaping wound, the endless nights staring at the ceiling planning impossible budgets, had to end. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle, the sheer, breathtaking audacity of it all. The way she wore her theft like an accessory, a status symbol to be flaunted in public, daring anyone to question it. And for so long I had been too stunned, too hurt, too conditioned by a lifetime of putting family harmony, no matter how false, above my own needs. My son, her husband, sat beside her, oblivious or perhaps willfully blind, nodding along as she regaled some story about a holiday. He looked tired, worn down by his own quiet compromises, a stranger to the boy I had raised. The air in the cafe, thick with the smell of burnt coffee and sweet syrups, suddenly felt suffocating. I wanted to scream, to point, to shatter the carefully constructed facade of their perfect little world. But I didn't. Not yet. I just watched the bag, the symbol of my undoing, and felt something hard and cold begin to crystallize deep within me, replacing the soft, vulnerable tissue of my old heart. The pension wasn't just money, it was my independence, my dignity, the promise of a quiet life, free from worry after decades of hard work. It was the roof over my head that I was now struggling to keep, the heating I couldn't afford to turn up in winter, the small comforts of aging I had looked forward to. And she had plucked it from under me with the same careless ease with which she chose that expensive handbag. It wasn't a mistake, not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, calculated act, shrouded in layers of false concern and helpfulness, until the trap sprung shut. I remembered the endless conversations, the way she'd insisted on taking over my finances, assuring me it would be easier, more efficient, that I wouldn't have to worry my pretty little head about numbers. Pretty little head, at 68, the condescension layered with saccharine sweetness, had been a warning I hadn't heeded. So desperate was I for things to be simple, for my son's wife to like me, for our family to be close. I had handed over my bank details, my login information, even the key to the old metal box where I kept important papers, feeling a sense of relief that someone competent was taking charge. Competent. She was. Competent at betrayal. She had emptied it, methodically over months, perhaps longer. Transfers made under the guise of managing my bills, setting up investments. God knows what other lies she'd concocted. The statements which I used to pore over with my reading glasses suddenly stopped arriving, or were intercepted, she explained, because online is so much faster, Mum, and she would just give me a quick summary. A quick summary that painted a picture of health and growth, while the reality was a slow, insidious draining. By the time I realized something was terribly wrong, when checks started bouncing and the bank called with hushed, concerned tones about overdrafts I couldn't comprehend, it was too late. The bulk was gone. My pension lump sum, the careful accrual of 40 years of working life, vanished into the ether, into accounts I couldn't trace, into purchases I could only guess at, like that bag, and the shoes, and the holidays, and the complete refurbishment of their kitchen, the one I had admired, not knowing it was built on the foundation of my stolen security. The irony was a bitter pill. I, who had pinched pennies my entire life, who had mended and reused and done without, was now facing potential homelessness, while she paraded around adorned in luxury, literally paid for by my deprivation. My quiet strength had always been in resilience, in making do, in finding joy in small things. But what happens when the very ground beneath your feet is stolen? Does resilience become stubbornness? Does quiet strength become naive foolishness? I felt a hot tear prick the corner of my eye, but I blinked it back. Not here, not in front of them, not in front of her. She would just see it as weakness, another confirmation of her superiority, another win. The tears could wait. Right now, there was only the cold resolve, the quiet hum of a decision being made in the deepest part of my soul. She wanted to flaunt it? Fine, let her. But she wouldn't get to keep it, not entirely, not in peace. The price of that bag and everything else was going to be higher than she ever imagined. I finished my tepid tea, every sip tasting like ash. I stood up, deliberately meeting my son's eye, forcing a small, tight smile. He smiled back, a quick, distracted flash of teeth, already turning back to his wife. She didn't even look up. She was too busy adjusting the strap of her crimson bag, preening slightly as a waitress passed by, a silent acknowledgement of its presence, its cost, its power. My power stolen and weaponized against me. But power dynamics could shift. They had to. My hands trembled slightly as I clutched my worn handbag, a sensible, decades-old leather tote purchased in a sale and kept meticulously clean. No logo, no flash, just practical durability. It felt suddenly heavy, weighted down by the sheer difference between us, by the scale of the injustice, but also perhaps by the growing weight of my own determination. I left the cafe, stepping out into the indifferent bustle of the street. The world hadn't stopped for my private catastrophe. People hurried by, living their lives, carrying their own burdens, oblivious to the quiet war that had just been declared in a corner booth, over expensive coffee and a designer bag. The air outside was cool, crisp, a stark contrast to the cloying warmth inside. I took a deep breath, letting the chill fill my lungs. It felt like a cleansing, a bracing shock. My future, the one I had so carefully planned, had been demolished. But maybe, just maybe, I could build something new from the wreckage, something stronger, something entirely my own, and she wouldn't like it one bit. Not one little bit. The house felt colder than usual. That evening, it wasn't just the thermostat, which I kept low to save money I no longer had in abundance. It was a pervasive chill that seeped into the bones, a reflection of the emptiness left by the vanished funds. Every creak of the old house seemed to whisper accusations. Every shadow held the shape of my folly, my trusting nature, that had been so ruthlessly exploited. I walked through the familiar rooms, touching the worn furniture, the faded photographs on the mantelpiece. There was a picture of my son Michael, as a boy, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a fish he'd caught on a rare family holiday. Next to it, a more recent one, taken at his wedding. He looked happy, if a little strained, and she, Sarah, was radiant, a vision in white, her smile wide and confident. I remembered feeling such hope that day that my son had found happiness, that I would gain a daughter. How naive I had been. Sarah hadn't just married Michael. She had married into a potential asset stream, and I, in my trusting simplicity, had made myself the primary source. I had been so eager to welcome her, to be the amenable mother-in-law, avoiding the stereotypes I'd witnessed in others. I had opened my home, shared family recipes, listened patiently to her endless stories of work triumphs and social engagements, none of which ever seemed to involve lifting a finger for someone else unless there was a clear benefit. Looking back, the signs were there, wasn't they? The subtle questions about my finances, asked casually over Sunday lunch, the way her eyes would light up when I mentioned the house was paid off or talked about my retirement plans, the unsolicited advice about investments, always leaning towards schemes that were complicated and required her expert handling. I had dismissed it as modern savvy, her generation being more financially literate than mine. My generation saved, theirs seemed to acquire. I hadn't grasped the difference until it was too late. The house, my sanctuary, now felt like a burden, a constant reminder of what I stood to lose. Property taxes, insurance, maintenance, they loomed like insurmountable mountains. I had planned to live here comfortably, maybe even make a few improvements, pass it on to Michael eventually. Now the thought of selling crossed my mind daily, a desperate measure to claw back some semblance of security, but even that felt like a capitulation, another piece of myself given away because of her actions. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was a profound violation of trust, of the sacred unspoken bond of family. How could someone you had welcomed into your home, into your life, someone who slept beside your only child, systematically dismantle your future without a flicker of conscience? Was there a moment where she hesitated? Did she ever see me struggling, worrying, and feel a pang of guilt? The image of the crimson bag flashed in my mind, and I knew the answer. No. There was no guilt, only the thrill of the acquisition, the validation of her own perceived cleverness. Michael, where did he fit into this? Was he complicit? Was he simply blind? Or was he just weak? He had always been easily swayed, eager to please. First his father, then his friends, and now, most devastatingly, his wife. Had she manipulated him too, convinced him I was incapable, that the money was safer with her, or perhaps that I had agreed to contribute substantially to their lifestyle? The latter felt sickeningly plausible. I could almost hear her silver tongue weaving a narrative where I was the generous benefactor, happily funding their dreams. It was easier for him to believe that than to face the reality of his wife's calculated cruelty and his own failure to protect me. This unspoken dynamic between us, this elephant in the room that was my stolen life savings, had created an impenetrable barrier. We talked about the weather, about his work, about trivialities, while the monumental issue that defined my daily existence was never mentioned. It was a conspiracy of silence, initiated by her, enforced by his avoidance, and perpetuated by my own fear of shattering the fragile peace, of losing my son entirely. But that fear was starting to erode. The sight of that bag, the casual indifference of it, had chipped away at the last vestiges of my patience, my willingness to maintain the illusion. I wasn't just fighting for money anymore. I was fighting for recognition of the wrong that had been done, for accountability, for my right to be angry, to be hurt, and to demand restitution. I walked into the kitchen, the heart of the home, now looking shabby compared to the image of their gleaming new one. I ran a hand over the worn countertop, a surface where countless meals had been prepared, where homework had been supervised, where life had simply happened. This kitchen, this house, held the echoes of a life built on honesty and hard work. Her kitchen, built with lies and theft, held only the hollowness of ill-gotten gains. It wasn't just about getting the money back. It was about stripping away the legitimacy she had granted herself through her action. It was about showing her, showing Michael, showing myself, that I was not some senile old woman to be easily dismissed and robbed. I was the matriarch, the foundation, and they had cracked that foundation, but they hadn't broken it, not yet. I opened the drawer where I kept my old address book, a dog-eared, slightly stained relic from decades past. My fingers traced the names, some crossed out, lives ended, others still present, anchors in a changing world. I needed advice, not from family, clearly, but from someone who understood the world outside this domestic battlefield. Someone who saw things in black and white, in terms of right and wrong, legal and illegal. There was a name there, an old friend from my working days, whose daughter had gone into law. I hadn't spoken to them in years, but the memory of her daughter, a bright, earnest young woman, surfaced. It was a long shot, a terrifying prospect actually, wading into the formal, intimidating world of legal action. But what choice did I have? Sink quietly into poverty and let her win completely? Or fight, risking everything, including the fractured relationship with my son, for a chance, however slim, at justice? The choice, illuminated by the glare of that crimson bag, was becoming clearer. Stalker. I would fight. I had to. The chill in the house didn't dissipate, but a different kind of warmth began to spread through me, slow and steady, like embers catching fire. It was the warmth of purpose, of a quiet simmering rage, finally finding its direction. The photographs on the mantelpiece seemed to watch me, silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. The happy wedding picture suddenly looked grotesque, a mask covering a rotten core. I turned away from it, towards the address book, towards the uncertain path ahead. The first step was always the hardest, they said, but I had taken harder steps in my life. Buried loved ones, faced unexpected hardships. This was different, more insidious, a wound inflicted by someone who was supposed to be family, but the principle remained. You did what you had to do, and what I had to do now was fight. The first call was difficult. My hands shook as I dialed the number, the unfamiliar rhythm of the rings echoing the anxiety in my chest. When a professional but kind voice answered, I faltered, the words catching in my throat. I need to speak to someone about financial matters, I managed, my voice barely a whisper. I felt ridiculous, a frail old woman admitting she'd been swindled by her daughter-in-law. It sounded like a plot from a sensationalist novel. Not my quiet, ordinary life, but the person on the other end was patient, guiding me through the initial intake questions. Explaining it aloud made it starkly real. The calculated deception, the years of trust building, the sudden devastating emptiness of my bank account. I didn't mention the bag in that first call. It felt too trivial, too symbolic, when I needed to convey the cold, hard facts of theft. But it was the bag, the undeniable proof of her careless indulgence, that had propelled me to make the call. It was the physical manifestation of the abstract loss, making it concrete, unbearable. The lawyer I was eventually put in touch with was a woman named Ms. Davies. Her voice was calm, steady, utterly professional. She listened without interruption as I recounted the story, laying bare the full extent of my vulnerability and my daughter-in-law's deceit. It was humiliating, admitting how easily I had been fooled, how readily I had handed over control of my life's savings. But Miss Davies didn't express pity or judgment. Her questions were sharp, precise, focusing on dates, amounts, documentation, the technical details of the betrayal. Do you have copies of the bank statements from before she took over? She asked. Any correspondence outlining the arrangement? Any record of these alleged investments or expenses? I felt a fresh wave of despair wash over me. I had trusted her. I hadn't kept meticulous records because I believed she was helping me. She had been so convincing, so charmingly persuasive. She handled everything, I admitted, my voice heavy with shame. She said she would send me summaries. The paper statements stopped coming. There was a brief silence on the line. I imagined Miss Davies making a note, her face impassive. And your son? She asked. Was he aware of the details of your financial arrangement with his wife? I don't know, I confessed. He didn't seem involved. She always handled the money side of things in their marriage too. I didn't want to cause trouble between them. Another silence. Mrs. Peterson, she said, her tone firm but not unkind. This is a serious matter. Without clear documentation, pursuing this will be challenging. It will require proving intent and tracing the funds. And it will likely put significant strain on your relationship with your son. Strain. The word felt inadequate. It would detonate a bomb in what remained of our family. Was I prepared for that? Was I prepared to lose Michael completely? To turn the quiet, unspoken conflict into open warfare? The thought was terrifying. He was my only child, the anchor of my life, even if that anchor felt like it was dragging along the seabed lately. But then I pictured her again, laughing over her expensive pastry, that crimson bag on the table, a monument to her lies. I pictured the cold house, the rising bills, the gnawing fear of destitution, and I knew I couldn't back down. The strain was already there, a constant, invisible pressure crushing my spirit. Fighting, even if I lost, felt like the only way to reclaim my sense of self, my agency. I understand, Miss Davies, I said, my voice gaining a little strength. I know it will be difficult, but I have to try. I worked my whole life for that money. It's everything I have. All right, she said. The first step is to gather whatever evidence you can. Bank statements, emails, any written communication regarding your finances. No matter how informal, we can also request bank records, but that process takes time. In the meantime, I'll draft a letter to your daughter-in-law outlining your concerns and requesting a full accounting of your funds. A letter. The thought of it felt both empowering and terrifying. It was a formal declaration, stepping out of the shadows of passive suffering into the arena of confrontation. And my son? I asked, the fear creeping back into my voice. Should I talk to him first? Miss Davies paused. That's a personal decision, Mrs. Peterson. Legally, your claim is against your daughter-in-law. However, given the family dynamic, involving your son is almost inevitable. Be prepared for that conversation. Whatever you decide, there was no easy way out. No path that preserved the tattered remnants of my family life while also pursuing justice. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. I spent the next few days sifting through old boxes, searching for any scrap of paper related to my finances. It was a painful process. Each faded statement, each canceled check, a reminder of a time when my life felt secure, manageable. I found bank statements from before Sarah took over, showing a healthy balance, the culmination of decades of careful saving. I found withdrawal slips, signed by her, dated after she began managing my accounts. Large sums transferred with vague descriptions like investment or household expenses. Household expenses for whose household? Not mine, that was for sure. My expenses were modest, predictable. These sums were enormous, disproportionate to my needs. Each discovery fueled the quiet fire within me, hardening my resolve. The sheer scale of the theft, the cold, calculated way it had been executed, was almost unbelievable. And all the while she had smiled, offered me tea, listened sympathetically to my minor ailments, her hand perhaps already reaching for another large sum from my dwindling funds. It was a level of duplicity that left me breathless. I found a few emails, brief exchanges where I'd asked for updates, and she'd replied with reassuring vagueness, promising detailed reports that never materialized. It was damning, not in what it said, but in what it omitted. The careful evasion of specific numbers. I gathered everything I could, placing the documents carefully in a box, each piece of paper feeling heavier than the last, a physical burden reflecting the weight on my soul. This small collection represented the fragments of my shattered financial life, and it had to be enough to start. It had to. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. I wasn't there to see her receive it, but I could imagine the scene. The crisp envelope bearing the law firm's letterhead, her initial surprise, perhaps annoyance at receiving formal correspondence. Then the opening of it, the words hitting her like a physical blow, stripping away the layers of pretense and denial she had so carefully constructed. I imagined the color draining from her face, the sudden understanding that the game was up, that I wasn't the easily manipulated victim she had assumed. My son called that evening, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Mom, what is this? This letter? A lawyer, what's going on? His tone was accusatory, as if I were the one causing the trouble, disrupting the peace. It was maddening. What's going on, Michael? I said, keeping my voice steady, deliberately calm, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. Is that your wife stole my pension? She emptied my accounts, that's what's going on. There was a stunned silence on the other end. Then a rush of words, defensive, disbelieving. Stolen? That's a ridiculous accusation. Sarah would never. There must be some misunderstanding. She was helping you, helping me to become destitute, Michael. Is that what you call help? My voice rose slightly despite my efforts. She took everything. Every penny I had saved for my old age. And you know it, or you choose not to know it. That's not fair, Mum. I didn't know anything about the details of your finances. Sarah handled it. She said she was investing for you, making sure you were set up comfortably. His words were tumbling out now, a desperate attempt to distance himself, to maintain his willful ignorance. Investing? In designer handbags and expensive holidays, Michael. Is that where my pension went? The image of the crimson bag was sharp in my mind, a tangible symbol of her theft and his complicity, whether active or passive. I don't believe you, he stammered. Sarah said. She said you were confused sometimes, that you didn't understand how money works now. She said she was protecting you. Confused. Mentally incompetent. That was their narrative, the one that justified their actions and absolved him of responsibility. It was a vicious twist of the knife. I am not confused, Michael. I know exactly what happened. Your wife systematically stole from me, and that letter is just the beginning. You can't do this, Mum. You can't sue Sarah. She's my wife. This will destroy our family. His voice was pleading now, laced with panic. Our family, the one she had already destroyed by her actions, and he by his inaction. The irony was suffocating. She destroyed it, Michael, when she stole my future, I said, the quiet resolve hardening my voice. I didn't want this. I tried to talk to her, to you, but you wouldn't listen. You pretended not to see what was happening. That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time you asked me how I was really doing, Michael? Not just a polite, "Are you okay?" but really looked at my life, seen how I'm struggling? You were too busy enjoying the benefits of her management, of my money. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. There was a long silence. I could almost hear him processing the implications, the crumbling facade of his comfortable life. Mum, please, let's talk about this. Don't get lawyers involved. We can sort this out in the family. In the family? I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. Is that what we are? A family where one member preys on another? Where trust is a weapon and loyalty is conditional on silence? Sarah didn't steal, he began, but I cut him off. Don't lie to me, Michael. Don't insult my intelligence. I have the proof, and Miss Davies will find more. You'll regret this, he said, his voice cold now, defensive again. You'll alienate everyone. You'll be alone. It was a threat, a chillingly familiar tactic from Sarah, echoed by her husband. Alienate everyone. Was he referring to himself? Was this his ultimatum? Choose between my son and justice? The old me, the one who prioritized harmony above all else, might have caved, might have retreated, accepted the loss, and lived with the quiet bitterness, for the sake of maintaining a fragile connection. But that person was gone, replaced by someone forged in the fire of betrayal, someone who had nothing left to lose but her dignity. If fighting for what is right, for what is mine, means being alone, I said, my voice clear and steady, then so be it. I won't be alone with the knowledge that I let someone steal my life's work and got away with it. There was another pause, even longer this time. I heard him sigh, a sound of frustration and resignation. I'll talk to Sarah, he said finally, his voice flat. You do that, I replied, and tell her I'm not backing down. The call ended abruptly. I stood there, the phone still in my hand, my heart pounding. I had done it. I had faced him, spoken the truth, and refused to yield. It felt terrifying, exhilarating, and profoundly sad all at once. Sad for the boy he had been, sad for the man he had become, caught in his wife's web, sad for the family that was irretrievably broken, but also a sense of liberation. The truth was out, the battle lines were drawn, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope, a fragile belief that I might actually win, not just the money, but myself back. The house still felt cold, but the chill was different now. It wasn't the cold of despair, but the bracing chill of a battlefield, the air sharp with anticipation. I was ready. Life became a series of tense encounters and legal exchanges. Sarah's response to the letter, delivered through her own lawyer, was a masterpiece of deflection and counter-accusation. It didn't deny the transfers entirely, but framed them as legitimate expenses incurred on my behalf. Investments that had unfortunately soured, miraculously, all of them. and funds generously given to her and Michael with my full knowledge and consent. My confusion and frailty were mentioned frequently. Attempts to paint me as an unreliable witness, a sad old woman who didn't understand her own finances. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. It was gaslighting on a monumental scale, a systematic attempt to undermine my sanity and credibility. They produced selective records, incomplete statements, and a few carefully worded emails from me, taken out of context, that seemed to support their narrative. My lawyer, Davies, was a formidable force. She saw through the flimsy excuses and outright lies immediately. "This is typical," she said, her voice calm, almost weary. "They muddy the waters. Hope you'll get confused or give up, but the discrepancies are clear. Mrs. Peterson, large sums moved without explanation, funds disappearing into accounts that don't belong to you. No evidence of these supposed investments. Their story doesn't hold up under scrutiny." We began the painstaking process of discovery, requesting full bank records, tracing the movement of funds, building a timeline of the theft. It was slow, frustrating work, filled with delays and obfuscation from their side. Every request for information was met with resistance. Every deadline pushed back. It felt like they were trying to exhaust me, financially and emotionally. And there were days, many days, when I felt like giving up. The stress was immense. The constant worry, the legal fees accumulating even before a trial was in sight. Sleep was elusive. My nights haunted by fragmented nightmares of losing my home, of being dependent on the very people who had wronged me. Michael remained distant, his calls rare and strained, still clinging to Sarah's version of events, or perhaps simply unable to confront the reality of his wife's actions and his own failure to protect me. When we did speak, it was like walking on eggshells. The conversation circling the enormous silent object between us. He never mentioned the bag, but I knew it was there, a shimmering symbol of his complicity, a constant reminder of the cost of his silence. Sarah made sure I saw it sometimes, a casual display of her continued disregard. We crossed paths unexpectedly at the grocery store once. She was pushing a cart overflowing with expensive organic produce and gourmet items, looking every inch the successful, carefree woman. The crimson bag was slung over her shoulder, catching the fluorescent light. She saw me, and for a split second her smile faltered, a flicker of something I couldn't quite read. Fear? Annoyance? Crossing her face. Then it was replaced by the familiar saccharine sweetness. "Oh, hello, Mum. Fancy meeting you here," she chirped, as if we were simply acquaintances bumping into each other, not adversaries engaged in a bitter legal battle. "You're looking well," she added, her eyes scanning me, a subtle judgment in her tone. I knew I looked tired, worn down. The struggle was taking its toll. "I'm managing," I said, keeping my voice flat, devoid of emotion. I looked past her, at the crimson bag, then back at her face, holding her gaze. "It's surprising, isn't it?" I said, my voice low, deliberate, how quickly things can change. How easily someone can lose everything they worked for. Her smile tightened, the sweetness curdling at the edges. "Well, life is full of surprises," she said, her voice brittle. "You never know what's around the corner." It was a thinly veiled threat, a reminder that she still held power, that she could still make things difficult for me. But the sight of her, so confident, so unapologetic, fueled the fire within me. I saw the bag, I saw her face, and I saw the stark contrast between her effortless consumption and my precarious existence. This wasn't just about money, it was about justice, about holding her accountable for the damage she had inflicted. "No, you don't," I agreed, a small hard smile touching my lips. "You truly never know what's around the corner. Sometimes, it's consequences." I didn't wait for her response. I pushed my own modest cart past her, the wheels squeaking slightly on the polished floor. My cart contained necessities, items chosen for their price and practicality. Her cart was a monument to excess, paid for by my stolen security. The contrast was sickening, but also empowering. She might have the expensive groceries and the designer bag, but she didn't have peace of mind. She didn't have the truth on her side, and she didn't have my quiet surrender anymore. The encounter was brief, but it solidified my resolve. She was trying to provoke me, to intimidate me, to make me back down. But seeing her like that, living a life of luxury built on my ruin, only strengthened my determination to fight. This wasn't just a legal case anymore. It was a moral imperative. The legal process ground on, slow and deliberate, revealing more layers of Sarah's deception. The bank records finally obtained after countless delays painted a damning picture. Large, unexplained withdrawals and transfers, often occurring immediately after she had visited me or discussed my finances. Payments to luxury retailers, travel agencies, even large cash withdrawals that vanished without a trace. There were dozens, maybe hundreds of transactions that couldn't be explained by my modest living expenses or the investments she claimed to have made. Miss Davies and her team meticulously compiled the evidence, building a timeline of theft that spanned over 2 years. It was clear, systematic, and utterly ruthless. Reading through the detailed spreadsheets and bank statements was like witnessing the slow-motion demolition of my life savings, each line item a small, calculated blow. I felt a mix of cold anger and deep sorrow. This wasn't the act of someone desperate or in need. This was the act of someone greedy, someone who saw an opportunity and took it regardless of the human cost. The investments she claimed had failed turned out to be non-existent, or at best vague schemes she couldn't provide any paperwork for. The money simply disappeared into her and Michael's joint accounts, and from there into their lavish lifestyle. It became increasingly clear that Michael was either deliberately turning a blind eye or was complicit in a way that went beyond mere ignorance. The timing of some of the transfers coincided with significant purchases they had made. The down payment on a new car, a luxury vacation, the expensive renovations to their home. Could he really have believed that Sarah was funding all of this on her salary alone? It strained credulity to the breaking point. The thought of my son benefiting, directly or indirectly, from the theft of his own mother's life savings was almost too painful to bear. It added another layer to the betrayal, twisting the knife deeper. Was his silence a form of complicity? Was his avoidance a way of protecting himself from the uncomfortable truth, or protecting his wife at my expense? The tension between us was a palpable thing, a heavy shroud whenever we spoke. He would ask about the case, not with concern for me but with veiled irritation at the disruption it was causing his life. "Isn't there some way to settle this, Mum?" he asked one day, his voice tight. "This is putting a huge strain on things here." Sarah is devastated. Devastated. The word landed like a blow. She was devastated by being caught, by facing consequences for her actions. What about my devastation? What about the years of worry and hardship she had inflicted on me? "She caused the strain, Michael," I said, my voice weary. "Not me. All I want is what was taken. But the legal fees, it's costing everyone a fortune. Couldn't you just accept a settlement? Something to make this go away? Make it go away?" I repeated, the anger rising. "You think this is just about money? It's about right and wrong, Michael. It's about her taking everything I had and then lying about it. And you? You seem more concerned about her feelings than about the fact that your mother was robbed. That's not fair," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. He was trapped, caught between his wife and his conscience, and it was clear which way he was leaning. The conversation ended, as they all did lately, in frustration and unresolved anger. I felt the distance between us growing wider with each passing day, a chasm opening up that I feared might never be bridged. It was the bittersweet nature of this fight. Winning might mean losing my son, but losing meant losing everything. My small house, my independence, my dignity. The symbolic object, the house, felt more crucial than ever. It wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was a tangible link to my past, a potential anchor for my future. Losing it because of Sarah's theft felt like the ultimate defeat, a final erasure of my carefully built life. I walked through the rooms, touching the walls, the worn banister on the stairs. Every object held a memory, a piece of my history. This house was a part of me, and I refused to let her take it too, indirectly by leaving me unable to afford to keep it. The legal battle intensified. Depositions were scheduled, tense affairs where Sarah, coached by her lawyer, maintained her facade of injured innocence, twisting facts and feigning ignorance. Michael was deposed as well, hesitant and uncomfortable, clearly trying to avoid directly contradicting his wife while also not wanting to openly lie. His testimony was evasive, filled with "I don't recall," and Sarah handled that, a pathetic display of moral cowardice. It was painful to watch, to see my son shrink under pressure, prioritizing his wife's deceit over his mother's truth. But his very evasiveness, his inability to provide clear support for Sarah's claims, implicitly strengthened my case. Miss Davies pointed this out. "He's not helping her," she said after his deposition. "He's hurting her. He's showing he knows something is wrong even if he won't admit it. He's the weak link, the weak link." It was a harsh assessment, but accurate. My son, the boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and tangled fishing lines, was now a weak link in a legal battle against his own mother. The thought was devastating, but it didn't deter me. The fight wasn't just for the money anymore. It was for the truth, for accountability, for the principle that you couldn't steal from others and expect to get away with it, no matter who you were or who you were married to. The stakes felt higher than ever. My future, my home, and what remained of my family hung in the balance. But the quiet resolve within me had hardened into something unbreakable. I would see this through, whatever the cost. As the trial date loomed, the pressure mounted. Settlement offers came and went, always laughably low. Attempts to buy my silence and avoid public exposure. Miss Davies advised against accepting them. "They know we have a strong case," she explained. "They're hoping you'll fold under the stress, take something just to make it end. But the amounts are insulting, barely covering a fraction of what was taken, let alone the legal costs or the emotional distress." I agreed with her. It wasn't about the money. Not entirely. It was about the principle. Accepting a pittance would feel like admitting defeat, validating their actions. I wanted justice, a formal acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done. The prospect of testifying was daunting, facing Sarah and Michael in a courtroom, recounting the painful details of the betrayal under oath, having my character and credibility potentially questioned by their lawyer. It was terrifying, but I knew I had to do it. My story, my experience was at the heart of the case. I spent hours with Miss Davies, rehearsing my testimony, going over the timeline, the documents, anticipating the cross-examination. She was patient, thorough, instilling in me a sense of quiet confidence. "Just tell the truth, Mrs. Peterson," she said. "Stick to the facts. Your sincerity and the evidence will speak for themselves." The house became my sanctuary during this time, a place to gather my strength. I walked around it, touching the familiar objects, drawing comfort from the history embedded in its walls. The photograph of young Michael grinning seemed to look at me with a mixture of innocence and reproach. The wedding photo of him and Sarah remained on the mantelpiece, a constant painful reminder of the source of my troubles, yet I couldn't bring myself to remove it. It felt important in a morbid way to keep the evidence of the betrayal in plain sight. It was a symbol of what I was fighting against and for. As the trial date grew closer, the tension with Michael became unbearable. He stopped calling altogether. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that he was furious, blaming me for forcing this public confrontation, for ruining their lives. The irony was a bitter, indigestible lump in my throat. They had ruined my life, or at least tried to, and now they resented the consequences of their actions. I thought of the crimson bag swinging from Sarah's arm, a carefree display of wealth acquired through calculated theft. That bag represented their lack of conscience, their entitlement, their belief that they were above the rules. It was a constant, infuriating reminder of what they had done and how little remorse they felt. The day of the trial arrived. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple, respectable outfit. I wanted to look like myself. A woman who had worked hard, lived honestly, and was now seeking justice. Walking into the courthouse felt surreal, like entering a different world governed by its own strict rules and procedures. Seeing Sarah and Michael across the courtroom was jarring. Sarah looked composed, even defiant, dressed impeccably, her face a mask of cool confidence. Michael sat beside her, looking drawn and uncomfortable, avoiding my gaze. Our eyes met for a brief second, and I saw a flash of something. Regret? Shame? Before he quickly looked away. He was a stranger to me now, separated not just by the physical space of the courtroom, but by an emotional and moral distance that felt insurmountable. The trial began. I listened as Davies presented our case, laying out the timeline of the theft, presenting the damning bank records, explaining the calculated nature of Sarah's actions. The numbers, read aloud in the formal setting of the courtroom, sounded even more shocking. Vast sums disappearing into the abyss of her spending. Then it was my turn to testify. I walked to the witness stand, my legs feeling shaky, but my resolve firm. I took the oath, my hand on the Bible, and felt a surge of strength. This was it. My chance to tell my story, in my own words, to a judge who would listen without interruption, without denial, without gaslighting. I spoke about my life, my work, my careful saving, my plans for retirement. I spoke about my son and welcoming Sarah into our family. I spoke about her offer to help with my finances, my initial relief, and the slow dawning realization that something was terribly wrong. I recounted the dwindling bank balance, the bouncing checks, the crushing moment of understanding that I had been robbed. I spoke about the emotional toll it had taken, the worry, the sleepless nights, the feeling of helplessness and betrayal. I tried to keep my voice steady, factual, but the emotion was raw, bubbling just beneath the surface. I saw Sarah watching me, her face impassive, but her eyes, I imagined, holding a flicker of something she couldn't entirely conceal. Michael still wouldn't look at me. The cross-examination was difficult, just as Ms. Davies had warned. Sarah's lawyer was aggressive, trying to paint me as forgetful, confused, perhaps even senile. He twisted my words, took things out of context, implied that I had agreed to give Sarah and Michael large sums of money as gifts. But I held firm. I corrected him. I explained. I calmly refuted his accusation. I was nervous, yes, but I was also determined. I was telling the truth, and that gave me strength. I saw the judge watching me, his expression serious, taking notes. I hoped he saw the truth in my words, the genuine pain and indignation behind my calm demeanor. The fight was far from over, but standing there, speaking my truth in that formal setting, felt like a small victory in itself. I had faced them, faced the system, and refused to be silenced. The crimson bag wasn't in the courtroom, of course, but its invisible presence was palpable, a specter haunting the proceedings, a silent witness to the cost of greed and betrayal. The trial proceeded, a slow and draining process of presenting evidence, cross-examining witnesses, and listening to legal arguments. Expert witnesses testified about financial forensics, tracing the flow of money and highlighting the irregularities. Ms. Davies systematically dismantled Sarah's defense, exposing the inconsistencies in her story and the lack of evidence to support her claims of legitimate expenses or failed investment. Sarah testified, maintaining her composure for the most part, sticking to her fabricated narrative, portraying herself as a victim of my supposed confusion and ingratitude. But under Miss Davies's calm, persistent questioning, cracks began to show. She faltered when asked about specific dates and amounts, contradicted herself on details, and became visibly flustered when confronted with irrefutable bank records showing payments for luxury items immediately following large transfers from my account. It was a tense and uncomfortable display, watching someone so clearly attempting to deceive the court. Michael also testified again, called by their side. He was even more hesitant than during his deposition, his answers vague and evasive. He clearly didn't want to harm Sarah's case, but he also couldn't bring himself to outright lie to support her most egregious falsehoods, particularly about my supposed consent to large gifts. His testimony was more damaging to her than helpful, highlighting his own lack of knowledge about my finances and his reliance on Sarah's representations. It confirmed what I suspected. He was caught in her web, unwilling or unable to break free, sacrificing his integrity for a life built on deceit. Witnessing his testimony, his discomfort and evasiveness, was profoundly sad. This was the man my son had become, not a perpetrator himself perhaps, but certainly an enabler, someone who had allowed wrong to flourish through his silence and passive acceptance. The distance between us solidified into a cold, hard fact. Whatever the outcome of the trial, the relationship with my son was irrevocably changed, perhaps broken beyond repair. This was the heavy price of fighting for justice, the bittersweet cost of reclaiming my life. The symbolic object, the house, remained a central concern. Maintaining it during the legal battle was a constant struggle. I had to cut back on everything, rely on savings from a small emergency fund I'd squirreled away years ago, money I'd forgotten about and which Sarah hadn't found. It was a precarious existence, living day to day, worrying about every bill. The thought of losing the house, the place where I had built my life, because of Sarah's greed, was a persistent fear. It wasn't just a financial loss, it was an emotional amputation. It represented security, continuity, the tangible proof of a life lived fully and honestly. Her designer bag, in contrast, represented fleeting luxury, superficial status, a temporary covering for the emptiness inside her. It was the ultimate symbol of the moral bankruptcy of her actions. During a break outside the courtroom one day, I saw Sarah standing alone, speaking animatedly on her phone. She looked stressed, the perfect facade beginning to crack under the pressure of the trial. And then I saw it, the glint of polished crimson, as she adjusted her grip on the phone. The bat, even here, at the courthouse, embroiled in a lawsuit about stolen money, she couldn't part with it. It was more than an accessory. It was a totem, a declaration of her lifestyle, a defiant middle finger to the consequences she was facing. Seeing it, here now, filled me with a fresh surge of anger and determination. That bag was purchased with my sacrifices, my future, my peace of mind. It was a tangible link to the injustice I was fighting against. It spurred me on, reminding me why I was enduring this ordeal. It wasn't just about the money in abstract. It was about the life that money represented, the security and dignity that bag had cost me. Closing arguments came. Davies delivered a powerful summary of our case, presenting the overwhelming evidence of theft and exposing the hollowness of Sarah's defense. She spoke about the human cost of financial elder abuse, the violation of trust, the devastating impact on the victim's life. Their lawyer countered, attempting to emphasize my supposed confusion and painting the transfers as well-intentioned, but perhaps mismanaged attempts to help me. He tried to appeal to the idea of family disputes, best handled outside of court, implying I was being overly litigious and vindictive, but the evidence was stacked against them. The numbers didn't lie, and Sarah's attempts to explain them away had been unconvincing. As the judge retired to consider the verdict, a wave of exhaustion washed over me. The tension of the past few weeks, the past few years, felt like a physical weight. I had done everything I could. I had gathered the evidence, found a skilled lawyer, and told my truth under pressure. The outcome was now out of my hand. But looking at Sarah, her face now pale and drawn, and Michael slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, I felt a strange sense of quiet satisfaction. Even if the judgment wasn't everything I hoped for, I had forced them to face the consequences of their actions. I had exposed their deceit, and that in itself felt like a significant victory. The inversion of the power dynamic was almost complete. She had wielded power over me through deceit and theft. Now I had wielded power over her through truth and the legal system. It was a bitter, painful kind of power, but it was mine. The wait for the verdict was agonizing. Every phone call, every knock on the door sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I tried to distract myself, tending to my small garden, rereading old books, anything to keep my mind from replaying every moment of the trial. The house felt quiet, too quiet, the silence amplifying my anxiety. The photograph of Michael and Sarah on the mantelpiece seemed to mock me, their smiling faces a stark contrast to the current reality. I still hadn't removed it. It felt like a test, a reminder of the source of the pain, a challenge to overcome the bitterness. The crimson bag, though not physically present, was a constant shadow in my thoughts, a vivid symbol of the injustice. Would the judge see it for what it was, not just an expensive accessory, but a trophy of theft? Finally, the call came. It was Ms. Davy. Her voice, usually calm and measured, held a note of triumph. "We won, Mrs. Peterson," she said. "The judge ruled in our favor." A wave of relief, so powerful it made my knees weak, washed over me. He found Sarah liable for financial elder abuse and theft. He ordered her to repay the full amount, plus damages and legal costs. The full amount, more than I had dared to hope for. It wasn't just a partial settlement. It was restitution, a complete vindication of my claims. Tears welled up in my eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming relief and a profound sense of justice served. Decades of careful saving, stolen in a calculated act of betrayal, were finally being returned. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle. It was the formal acknowledgement that I had been wronged, that my voice had been heard, and that her actions had consequences. And Michael? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "The judgment is against Sarah," Miss Davies said. "The judge acknowledged your son's lack of direct involvement in the fraudulent transfers, though he did comment on his failure to oversee his wife's handling of your affairs. Given the circumstances, legally the liability rests with her." It was a nuanced outcome for Michael, not legally culpable, but implicitly criticized for his passivity, his willful ignorance. It was a small comfort perhaps that he wasn't formally branded a thief like his wife, but it didn't erase his failure in my eyes. The financial aspect was settled, or at least legally decided. Getting the money back might be another battle, depending on Sarah's ability or willingness to pay, but the judgment was a powerful tool. It meant I could potentially reclaim my financial security, keep my home, live out my remaining years without the gnawing fear of destitution. It meant I could rebuild, but the emotional landscape remained scarred. The phone rang again a few hours later. It was Mike. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, barely recognizable. "I heard," he said, the two words heavy, with unspoken accusations. We're going to appeal." Appeal? Of course. She wouldn't go down without a fight, wouldn't accept responsibility quietly. It was a delay tactic, another attempt to drag things out, to exhaust me. "Michael," I said, my voice gentle but firm. The judge heard all the evidence. He made his decision. "It wasn't fair," he said. "Sarah didn't steal anything. She was trying to help." The denial, persistent and unwavering. He was still clinging to her narrative, even in the face of a legal judgment. Or maybe he was simply protecting himself, unable to confront the truth about the woman he had married. "Michael, please," I pleaded softly. "Look at the evidence. Look at what's happened. Your wife took my life savings. This isn't a misunderstanding." "I don't believe you," he said, his voice hardening. "You're doing this to hurt us, to punish us." The conversation devolved quickly from there, a painful exchange of accusations and denials. It was clear that the judgment had only widened the rift between us. He saw me as the aggressor, the one who had shattered their lives, not the victim seeking justice. It was a devastating realization. I had fought for what was right, and in doing so, I had seemingly lost my son. The bittersweet nature of the victory settled over me like a heavy cloak. I had won the battle for my finances, for my dignity, for accountability, but I had lost the war for my family. When I hung up the phone, I walked over to the mantelpiece. I looked at the photograph of Michael and Sarah. Their smiling faces, once a symbol of hope, now seemed like a relic from a different life, a life built on a foundation of sand. I reached out and picked up the frame. It felt cold in my hands. This image, this representation of my son's chosen path and the woman who had led him down it, no longer belonged here, in this home I had fought so hard to save. It was a symbol of a past I needed to leave behind, a wound that needed to heal. With a deep breath, I turned the photograph face down. It wasn't an act of anger, but of acceptance. The past was the past. I had to focus on the future, on rebuilding my life, the house still stood, a testament to my resilience. The judgment was in my favor, a promise of financial security. I had faced betrayal, fought back, and emerged, scarred but not broken. The journey wasn't over. There was still the matter of collecting the judgment, and the possibility of an appeal. But the most significant hurdle had been cleared. I had reclaimed my power, not just over my finances, but over my own narrative. I was not a victim anymore. I was a survivor, an empowered survivor. The aftermath of the judgment was a period of cautious optimism and lingering tension. Sarah and Michael did file an appeal, as expected, but it was ultimately unsuccessful. The judge's ruling was upheld, the evidence against Sarah too compelling to overturn. The legal process, thankfully, was nearing its end. Now came the practical matter of collecting the judgment. This proved to be another hurdle. Sarah, despite her outward display of wealth, claimed she had no liquid assets. She tried to stall, to negotiate, to offer payment plans that stretched into the distant future. But Ms. Davies was relentless. We pursued legal means to enforce the judgment, placing liens on their property, the house they had renovated with my stolen funds, and even garnishing a portion of Sarah's income. It was a slow, arduous process, yielding only a fraction of what was owed at first. Seeing their carefully constructed world begin to unravel, piece by piece, was a strange experience. There was no joy in it, only a grim satisfaction that justice, however delayed and incomplete, was being served. The house they had bought, the cars they drove, the very lifestyle they flaunted, much of it was built on my stolen pension, and now they were being forced to pay the price. The crimson bag, I imagined, was still a constant companion, perhaps clutched a little tighter now, its gleam dulled by the shadow of legal consequences. I never saw it again after the encounter outside the courthouse, but its image was seared into my memory, forever linked to the lowest point of my life, and the catalyst for my fight. Michael remained estranged. He blamed me completely for their financial difficulties, for the stress Sarah was under, for the disruption to their lives. His calls stopped entirely. I heard from the mutual acquaintance that their marriage was under immense strain. Arguments were frequent, and the polished facade of their life together was cracking. It was a sad, inevitable consequence of building a relationship on a foundation of deceit and passive complicity. I grieved the loss of my son, the hopes I had held for his happiness, and our relationship. It was a profound sorrow that ran deeper than the financial loss. He had chosen his path, and that path had led him away from me. There was a quiet dignity in my solitude now. The house, safe for the moment, was filled with the echoes of my own life. A life lived independently and honestly. I started to make small changes, improvements I had put off for years, funded by the initial amounts recovered from the judgment. Repainting a room, fixing a leaky faucet, tending to the garden with renewed energy. Each small act of repair felt like a step forward, a way of reclaiming the space, asserting my presence and resilience. The photograph on the mantelpiece remained face down for a long time. Eventually I moved it to a drawer, tucked away with other relics of the past. It wasn't forgotten, but it no longer held a place of prominence in my daily life. My focus shifted from the pain of the past to the possibilities of the future. However modest, I re-established connections with old friends, joined a local book club, found small joys in simple things, a walk in the park, a cup of tea in the sunshine, the company of others who valued honesty and genuine connection. The journey had been dark and difficult, pushing me to the brink of despair, but facing the betrayal, fighting for myself and ultimately winning, at least legally and financially, had transformed me. The quiet, somewhat naive woman who had readily handed over her life savings was gone. In her place was someone stronger, more resilient, acutely aware of the darkness that could lurk beneath a charming surface, but also confident in her own ability to navigate it. I learned that quiet strength wasn't passive. It was the inner core that allowed you to endure and fight when necessary. It wasn't about being loud or aggressive, but about holding firm to your truth and your values, even when faced with overwhelming opposition. The scars remained, of course. The loss of my son was a wound that might never fully heal. The memory of the betrayal, the feeling of being so utterly vulnerable and exploited, would always be a part of me, but it no longer defined me. It was a chapter in my story, a dark chapter, but one that had ultimately led me to discover a strength I didn't know I possessed. The story of the crimson bag, paid for with my stolen pension, was a painful one, but it was also the story of resilience, of fighting back against injustice, and of reclaiming one's life, piece by painstaking piece. It was a bittersweet victory, a testament to the fact that sometimes to build a new future, you first have to confront and dismantle the lies of the past, no matter how painful the process. And that, I realized, was a kind of empowerment. Years passed, the enforcement of the judgment continued, a slow but steady drip of money returning to my accounts. It wasn't a sudden flood that erased the memory of hardship, but a gradual restoration of financial security. The house was fully repaired now, comfortable and warm, a true sanctuary once more. I had even been able to take a modest holiday, something I hadn't allowed myself for years, a small reclaiming of the experiences Sarah had bought with my money. The legal battles were over, the appeals exhausted. The court's judgment stood, a permanent stain on Sarah's record. I heard she had struggled professionally, the public nature of the lawsuit, and the judgment making it difficult for her to maintain her career and social standing. The carefully constructed facade she had presented to the world had crumbled, revealing the deceit beneath. The crimson bag, I often wondered, where was it now? Tucked away in a closet, a reminder of her downfall, sold to help pay off her debts, or perhaps still displayed, a defiant, pathetic attempt to cling to a lost status. It didn't matter anymore. The power it once held over me was gone. It was just an object, stripped of its symbolic weight by my fight and my recovery. Michael's silence continued. Years had passed since our last conversation. The mutual acquaintance occasionally shared snippets of information. He and Sarah were still together, living a less lavish lifestyle, burdened by debt and the lingering fallout of the lawsuit. There were no grandchildren, no shared family holidays, none of the things I had once dreamed of. The separation was absolute, a silence that spoke volumes about his choice, his continued loyalty to the woman who had wronged me. Over the bond with his mother, it remained a source of deep sadness, a quiet ache that never fully disappeared. But the sharpest edges of the pain had softened with time and healing. I had built a new life, filled with quiet purpose and genuine connections. My friends were my chosen family, offering support, laughter, and companionship. I volunteered at a local animal shelter, finding solace and unconditional affection in the company of creatures who asked for nothing but kindness. I learned new skills, took classes at the community center, embracing the opportunity to grow and learn in a way I hadn't allowed myself when I was focused on simply surviving. The empowerment I felt wasn't a sudden dramatic transformation. It was a quiet internal shift, a deepening of resilience, a solidifying of self-worth that couldn't be shaken by external events or other people's actions. I had faced my greatest fear, destitution and loss of independence, and I had fought my way back. I had stood up to someone who had tried to diminish and erase me, and I had prevailed. The experience had changed me, irrevocably. It had exposed the vulnerability of trust, the reality of greed, and the devastating impact of betrayal within a family. But it had also shown me my own capacity for strength, for perseverance, and for finding light, even in the darkest of times. I often thought about the early days of the betrayal, the shame, the fear, the feeling of being utterly helpless. The image of that crimson bag, mocking me in the cafe, felt like a distant nightmare, a catalyst that had inadvertently spurred me onto a path of self-discovery and reclamation. It was the ultimate irony. The very symbol of her cruelty had become the unlikely symbol of my awakening. I had lost my pension, yes, but I had gained something far more valuable: my voice, my agency, and an unshakable belief in my own strength. The bitterness remained, a low hum beneath the surface, a reminder of the cost, but it was tempered by gratitude for what I had learned and what I had rebuilt. My story wasn't a neat, happy ending. It was complex, layered with loss and gain, pain and healing. But it was my story, told in my own voice, finally free from the shadows of silence and shame. I was older now, perhaps a little more weathered, but also undeniably stronger. The quiet strength that had always been within me had been tested in the most brutal way. And it had not broken. It had bent. It had wavered. But ultimately, it had held. And that, I knew, was a victory that no amount of money, no designer bag, could ever buy. My home was warm, filled with the quiet hum of my own life, a life I had fought for and won back, piece by painstaking piece. And that was enough. More than enough.